Finland in early June carries a particular quality of light. The days have lengthened past the equinox, and the sun lingers well into the evening before finally conceding to a brief, pale darkness that never quite becomes full night. Lakes lie still across the landscape, their shores lined with birch and pine, with small clearings where families and young people have camped for generations. In 1960, this was not an unusual way to spend a summer weekend. A tent by the water. A campfire. The simple companionship of friends who believed, as young people often do, that the hours ahead belonged entirely to them. On the 5th of June, 1960, 4 teenagers made their way to the shore of Lake Bodom, in the municipality of Espoo, west of Helsinki. They were young enough that an overnight camp still felt like adventure, and old enough to manage it without adult supervision. Mila Ermeli Björklund was among them. Anya Kyllikki was there as well. Seppo and Tero Boaman completed the group of 3 who would not survive the night. The 4th member of the party was 15-year-old Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson. What they carried with them was ordinary. Sleeping bags. Food. The modest equipment of a lakeside camp. What the lake would hold by morning was anything but ordinary, and would become, over the decades that followed, the most famous unsolved homicide in Finnish history. The evening, by all accounts that can be reconstructed, proceeded without incident. This is a detail worth holding in the mind, because so many tragedies announce themselves early, with argument or unease or some visible fracture in the hours before. Here, the record suggests something quieter. Young people at a summer camp. Water lapping at the shore. The slow descent of a finished June night. Whatever came later arrived without leaving, in the surviving documentation, a clear warning in the daylight hours. In the early hours of the morning, an attack took place at the campsite. 3 of the 4 teenagers were killed. The methods involved a knife and a blunt instrument, though the specific sequence of events has been reconstructed only in part, and always through the filter of evidence that was gathered hours later, in daylight, by investigators working backward from a scene that had already been disturbed by survival, by weather, and by the passage of time. The weapons used in the attack were never recovered. No definitive forensic match has ever tied the violence to a single named individual in a way that produced a lasting conviction. Nils Gustafsson survived. He was found in the morning with injuries consistent with the attack, and his account of the night would become one of the central threads in everything that followed. A sole survivor at a scene of multiple deaths carries a weight that investigations and public opinion do not easily set down. Questions form naturally. What was seen? What was heard? What can be remembered when memory itself is injured? These are not accusations. They are the ordinary pressures that any case of this kind places upon the one who lived. The discovery of the scene came in the morning, when the stillness of the campsite had taken on a different character. 3 young people were dead. A 4th was alive and wounded. The Finnish summer, which had seemed so generous on the evening of the 5th, now framed a crime that would not be resolved in any final sense across the remainder of the 20th century, nor across the decades of the 21st. The initial investigation moved with the tools available in 1960. Photographs were taken. Measurements recorded. Witnesses in the surrounding area were questioned. The lakeshore, which had drawn campers before and would draw campers again in later years, became a fixed point in the national memory, a place where something terrible had happened without leaving behind the kind of evidence that closes a case quickly and cleanly. Leads were pursued. Persons of interest were identified and examined. Years passed. The case remained open. Among those who drew investigative attention over the decades was a man named Carl Gillström, a local figure whose connection to the lake and to the circumstances of the crime placed him within the orbit of suspicion. He was never convicted. Another name that would surface repeatedly in public discussion was Hans Assmann, a German-born man who lived in Finland and who would later be linked, in speculative contexts, to other unsolved cases in the region. Assman, too, was never convicted in connection with Lake Bodom. The official record does not support a single, settled answer naming either man as the perpetrator. For many years, the case existed in a particular kind of public space. It was famous enough that almost everyone in Finland knew the name Lake Bodom. It was unresolved enough that the fame never hardened into closure. Books were written. Documentaries were made. Theories circulated with the confidence that open cases sometimes invite, because absence of proof is not the same as absence of opinion, and a crime of this magnitude creates a gravity that pulls speculation toward it. Then, decades after the original murders, the investigation took a turn that few could have predicted when the tents were first pitched on the shore in 1960. Nils Gustafsson, the survivor, was himself charged. The prosecution advanced a theory that he had been responsible for the deaths of his 3 companions and had inflicted upon himself the injuries that had initially placed him in the position of victim rather than suspect. The trial took place in 2004, more than 44 years after the night in question. In 2005, Gustafsson was acquitted. The acquittal is an official finding, and it must be stated as such. A court examined the evidence available after the passage of more than 4 decades and determined that it was insufficient to support a conviction. This does not mean that every question about the night was answered. It means that the legal system, working with reconstructed evidence and the limitations that time imposes upon any cold case, could not reach the threshold required to declare guilt. Gustafsson returned to the legal status of a man not convicted of this crime. The case, from the perspective of the law, remained without a named perpetrator. It is important to separate what the prosecution argued from what the court found. The prosecution's theory was that the survivor himself had committed the killings. The court's finding was that this theory could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt. These are different statements, and conflating them is how open cases become tangled in public memory. A theory advanced in court is not a theory proven. An acquittal is not a declaration of innocence in every philosophical sense, but it is, in the legal sense that governs what a state can do to a citizen, a barrier to conviction. What theories exist outside the courtroom are more numerous. Some hold that a local man, acting alone, came upon the campsite in the darkness and committed the killings without ever being caught. Others suggest a foreign or outsider killer, a figure who passed through the area and left no durable trace. Still others return, again and again, to the names that investigators examined over the years, to Gillström, to Assman, to figures at the margins of the case who have been discussed in books and articles and late-night conversations. None of these theories has produced a conviction. That is the steady fact beneath all the variation. The forensic landscape of the case reflects its age. Evidence that might today be examined with techniques unavailable in 1960 has either degraded, been lost, or was never collected in a form that later science could revisit. The weapons were never found. The scene, by the time investigators arrived, had already been shaped by the survival of Gustafsson, by the movement of those who discovered the bodies, and by the ordinary contamination that attends any outdoor crime in the hours before formal preservation begins. Cold cases from the mid-20th century often share this quality. They are not unsolved because no one tried. They are unsolved because the night itself did not leave a complete record. For the families of Mila Ermeli Björklund, Anja Kyllikki, and Seppo Antero Boiman, the decades since 1960 have been measured in a particular way. Anniversaries. Renewed appeals. The slow awareness that a case famous enough to be discussed in every generation is not the same as a case solved in any lifetime. They were young people on an ordinary summer outing. That ordinariness is the foundation of everything else. They did not go to the lake expecting to become part of Finnish history. They went because the water was there, because the weather invited it, because friendship at that age feels like the primary fact of the world. Lake Bodom itself has continued through all of this. The water does not remember. The birch trees do not mark the years by the investigations they have witnessed. Campers have returned to shores nearby, perhaps unaware of the exact ground, perhaps fully aware and drawn by the same mixture of curiosity and unease that unresolved places generate. The lake is a geographical fact. The crime is a human fact attached to it, and the two do not separate easily in the national consciousness. The official position, stated in the plainest terms available, is this. On the 5th of June, 1960, 3 teenagers were killed at a campsite on the shore of Lake Bodom in Espoo, Finland. A 4th teenager survived with injuries. The weapons were not recovered. No individual has been convicted of the crime. Nils Gustafsson, the survivor, was tried decades later and acquitted in 2005. The case remains open. Theories continue. Local killers. Outsider killers. The survivor, as argued by the prosecution and rejected by the court. Named individuals who were investigated but never convicted. Each theory has its adherents. Each theory lacks the final weight of a courtroom verdict that has survived appeal and become history rather than argument. That distinction is where Lake Bodom rests tonight, in the space between what is widely discussed and what is officially proved. The cultural afterlife of Lake Bodom has sometimes blurred the boundary between the crime and the place. A Finnish heavy metal band took the name, drawing the case into a register far removed from the quiet of a lakeside camp. Documentaries have returned to the shore with cameras and reconstructions. Each retelling risks sharpening details that the original investigation left soft, and risks treating the acquittal of Gustafsson as a footnote rather than as a central legal fact. For anyone seeking to understand the case as it exists in the record, the band name and the popular culture are noise. The signal is simpler. 3 deaths. 1 survivor. No conviction. Investigators in the years after the acquittal did not, in the public record, announce a new primary suspect. The case returned to the status it had occupied before the prosecution of Gustafsson, famous, open, resistant to the kind of ending that a courtroom provides. Some observers felt that the trial had exhausted the most plausible remaining avenue, that if the survivor could not be convicted with the evidence available in the 21st century, then the truth might remain permanently out of reach. Others felt that the acquittal cleared Gustafsson in a sense that should have redirected attention toward suspects who had never been brought to trial at all. The official file does not declare which of these views is correct. Espoo itself has grown since 1960. The municipality that once seemed a lakeside retreat west of Helsinki has become part of the extended urban fabric of the capital region. The shore of Lake Bodom is not untouched, and the Finland of camping teenagers in June has changed in countless ways that have nothing to do with murder. Yet the case remains attached to the water, as if geography could hold memory more faithfully than institutions. And as this story settles into quiet, it may be worth returning to the image of the evening before. For young people at a lake in Finnish summer. Light lingering in the sky. The small sounds of water and wind and conversation. A camp that must have felt, in those hours, entirely ordinary. The record does not tell us what the 3 who did not survive dreamed that night, or whether they slept easily, or whether any presentiment touched them before sleep came. It tells us only that they did not wake into the morning they expected. If a summer night beside still water can end in violence that outlives every witness and every investigator who has touched the file, what does it mean that we continue to walk past lakes at dusk, trusting the darkness to pass without leaving a question that 60 years cannot answer? Stockholm in late February is a city of early darkness. The winter has not yet released its hold. Snow may lie along the sidewalks, or the air may carry that particular Scandinavian cold that is less about depth of snow than about the quality of the light, which arrives late and departs early, leaving the streets illuminated by lamps that throw a steady, practical glow over ordinary evening activity. In 1986, Sweden was a stable democracy, prosperous by any international measure, governed by a social democratic tradition that had shaped the country's post-war identity. The Prime Minister, Olof Palme, was a figure known well beyond Sweden's borders, a voice in international affairs, a politician who had governed and who, on the night of the 28th of February, did something that heads of government sometimes do in countries where security is not yet a constant shadow. He walked home from the cinema with his wife. The cinema was the Grand Onsvivagen, a central artery in Stockholm that carries traffic, pedestrians, and the rhythm of city life through the heart of the capital. Olof Palme and his wife Lisbeth had watched a film. They left the theater and began walking south along Sveavägen, toward the metro at Hoderget and the direction of their home. There was no elaborate security detail. This was, in the context of the time and the country, not unusual for Palme. Sweden's political culture had long carried a quality of accessibility that larger nations often found remarkable. The Prime Minister could, on certain evenings, be a man walking beside his wife on a city street, indistinguishable at a distance from any other couple leaving a late showing. At approximately 11:21 in the evening, a gunman approached from behind and fired. Olof Palme was struck at close range and fell. A second shot was fired. Lisbeth Palme was injured but survived. The attacker fled up a staircase into an alley and disappeared into the network of streets that a city provides to anyone who knows them, or who acts on instinct in the seconds after violence. The weapon was never recovered. The scene, on one of Stockholm's busiest streets, became within moments the center of a national emergency that would extend across years, then decades, without arriving at a conviction that has survived the full scrutiny of the legal process. Lisbeth Palme, wounded and in shock, was able to provide descriptions in the aftermath. Her account, and the accounts of others who were in the vicinity, formed the early architecture of the search. Witnesses differed, as witnesses do, on details of appearance, of movement, of the exact sequence of seconds. The police response was swift by the standards of any major city confronting the assassination of its head of government. Roadblocks were established. Searches were conducted. The investigation that opened that night would become one of the largest criminal inquiries in Swedish history. In the days and weeks that followed, the country moved through a grief that was both personal and constitutional. Palme had been a defining political figure. His death was not only a murder but a rupture in the sense of what Sweden understood itself to be. Flowers accumulated at the site. The funeral drew mourners from across the political spectrum and from abroad. And beneath the public mourning, investigators worked through thousands of tips, hundreds of potential leads, and the immense frustration of a crime committed in seconds on an open street, where the killer's path away from the scene fragmented almost immediately into possibilities. The early investigative landscape was crowded with theories that reflected the international character of Palme's career. Because he had been a prominent voice on global issues, including criticism of apartheid in South Africa, lines of inquiry extended beyond Sweden's borders. South African intelligence was examined as a possible context. The Kurdish separatist movement, the PKK, was investigated. Files from the former East German Stasi were reviewed in later years for any connection that might have been concealed in Cold War archives. These avenues were pursued seriously, because a crime of this magnitude demands that every plausible context be examined. They did not produce a conviction. Domestically, the investigation considered both organized conspiracies and the possibility of a single actor acting without institutional backing. Some theories held that the killing was a political assassination in the strictest sense, ordered and planned by an organization with resources and motive. Others held that it was a chaotic act by an individual whose full reasoning would never be clearly known. The gap between these positions has never been closed in a way that the Swedish legal system has been willing to convert into a final, unappealed verdict against a living defendant. In 1988, a man named Christer Pettersson was convicted of the murder. He had been identified by Lisbeth Palme in a lineup. The case appeared, for a moment, to have reached the resolution that a nation had been waiting for. Then, in 1989, Pettersson was acquitted on appeal. The appellate court found that the evidence was insufficient to sustain the conviction. The testimony that had seemed decisive at trial did not, under closer legal examination, carry the weight required to declare guilt with the permanence that a murder conviction demands. Pettersson was released. The case returned to the category of the unsolved, carrying with it the particular bitterness of a near resolution that did not hold. Pettersson himself became a figure of public fascination and controversy. He had a history that seemed, to some observers, to fit the profile of a man capable of spontaneous violence. He denied involvement in Palme's death. He was tried and acquitted. He was later convicted of other offenses. He died in 2004, taking with him whatever direct knowledge he may or may not have possessed. His death did not close the case. It complicated it, because a legal system that had already acquitted him once was left with questions that could no longer be put to him in a courtroom. For many years after the acquittal, the Palme assassination remained open in the official sense and open in the public sense, a wound that Swedish society examined repeatedly. New investigators were appointed. Cold case units revisited evidence with techniques that had not existed in 1986. The national conversation never fully settled. Books argued for competing theories. Documentaries presented competing narratives with the confidence that only hindsight and selective evidence can provide. Through all of this, the legal record maintained a careful distinction. Conviction requires proof. Acquittal means the proof was not enough. Neither statement is the same as a final historical truth independent of the courtroom. In February of 2020, Swedish prosecutors announced a conclusion that must be described with precision, because precision is what the case has always required. Chief Prosecutor Christer Petersson, who headed the investigation, stated that the inquiry had identified Christer Pettersson as the likely killer. He announced that the case was being closed because Pettersson was deceased and could not be charged or tried. This was a prosecutorial assessment, not a new conviction. It was not a unanimous verdict rendered by a court after a trial. It was the conclusion of an investigation that had been formally reopened and that had, in the view of the prosecutor, reached sufficient certainty to name a perpetrator, while acknowledging simultaneously that the legal process could go no further. The distinction matters for anyone trying to understand this case clearly. A prosecutor may say that an investigation has identified the likely killer. A court, in 1989, said that the evidence against that same man was not sufficient for conviction. Both statements exist in the official record. They are not identical. The 2020 announcement did not reverse the acquittal. It did not create a new trial or a new verdict. It placed upon the historical file a prosecutorial conclusion that Sweden's authorities regarded as the best available answer, while the earlier judicial acquittal remained a legal fact. What theories persist beyond the prosecutor's 2020 statement are varied. Some members of the public and some commentators continue to argue for foreign intelligence involvement, for conspiracies that a domestic investigation could not fully expose. Others argue that Pettersson was wrongly identified, that the lineup process was flawed, that the real killer was someone who never entered the frame of public suspicion. Still others hold that the prosecutor's 2020 conclusion is the most honest available endpoint, not perfect, not unchallengeable, but the nearest thing to resolution that a case of this age and complexity can offer. These positions coexist. None of them has produced a living defendant convicted in a court that has not reversed the judgment. The physical scene on Sveavägen has changed in the years since 1986. Cities renovate. Storefronts change. The staircase and alley that the gunman used to disappear remain part of the geography, but the street itself belongs to a Stockholm that has continued living, building, mourning, and arguing about what happened on a winter night when the Prime Minister walked home from a film. The Grand Cinema has its own history. The metro station at Hoterget still receives passengers who may or may not know that they are passing through a landscape marked by one of the 20th century's most prominent political killings. Lisbeth Palme survived the attack and lived until 2011. She carried the memory of the night and the weight of having been the closest witness to her husband's death. Her descriptions shaped the investigation at its most critical early stage and later became part of the contested evidence at trial. She did not, in the public record, arrive at a place of settled public certainty about every detail of what she saw in the seconds of the attack. No witness in such a moment ever fully does. The official findings, assembled across the decades, can be stated this way. On the 28th of February, 1986, Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, was shot and killed on Sveavägen in Stockholm. His wife Lisbeth was wounded. The weapon was not recovered. Christer Pettersson was convicted in 1988 and acquitted on appeal in 1989. In 2020, prosecutors identified Pettersson as the likely killer and closed the case, citing his death as the reason no further legal action could be taken. The earlier acquittal was not overturned by this announcement. Theories remain in circulation. Political assassination by foreign powers. Domestic conspiracy. Alternative suspects who were never charged. Random violence by an unknown individual. Each has been argued with passion and with varying degrees of evidence. None has replaced the two-part official record, an acquittal in court, and a prosecutorial conclusion 31 years later that named the same man as the likely perpetrator without the power to convict him. The weapon that killed Palme was never found, and that absence threads through every theory the case has produced. A handgun discarded in the hours after the shooting might have yielded fingerprints, serial numbers, ballistics links to other crimes. Without it, the investigation relied on witness description, on movement through the city, on the difficult work of placing a name upon a figure who was seen briefly and incompletely. Some investigators believe that the killer disposed of the gun in the waterways or back streets of Stockholm. Others believed it was carried out of the country. The official record confirms only that it was not recovered in a way that became part of a successful prosecution. The security culture of Sweden changed after Palme's death, as security culture changes in every nation that loses a leader to violence. The accessibility that had allowed a prime minister to walk from a cinema without a cordon of protection came to seem, in retrospect, like a form of innocence. Whether that innocence was admirable or naive depends on the values one brings to the question. What is not debatable is that the assassination ended an era of perceived safety at the highest level of Swedish public life. Christer Pettersson's life after the acquittal was marked by further contact with the law. He was convicted of other crimes. He gave interviews in which he sometimes appeared to toy with public curiosity about the Palme case. He denied guilt. He died in 2004, and with his death the possibility of a new trial, however unlikely it had already become, vanished entirely. The 2020 announcement was, in part, a response to that vanishing, an attempt to write an official last line in a file that the courts had already refused to close with a conviction. For listeners resting in the quiet of a late hour, the case may settle as a study in how a democracy responds when its most visible public servant is killed on an ordinary street. The investigation was vast. The grief was national. The legal outcome was incomplete in the way that only an acquittal followed by decades of further inquiry can be incomplete. Sweden continued. Governments changed. The file was closed in 2020 with a statement that was meant to end the official uncertainty, even as public uncertainty proved more durable. And if a winter walk from the cinema can end in a shot whose echo has not fully faded across 4 decades of investigation, what does it mean that we still step out into lit streets at night, believing that the city will simply carry us home? Linköping is a city of modest scale in southern Sweden, large enough to hold a university and the ordinary infrastructure of urban life, small enough that distances between neighborhoods can be walked in minutes and that local news travels with a particular intimacy. In October, the light thins and the air carries the first sustained chill of the approaching winter. Trees along residential streets begin to show color. Children return from school along familiar paths. Evening arrives earlier, and the city settles into the routines that make a place feel knowable, as if the map of daily life were fixed and could be relied upon from one autumn to the next. On the 19th of October, 2004, that knowability was broken in a way that the city has not been able to fully repair in the years since. 2 people were killed in separate locations within a span of minutes. They did not know each other in any ordinary sense. They were not connected by family or by friendship or by the shared geography of a single household. What connected their deaths was time, proximity, and the forensic evidence that investigators would later recover from both scenes. The official record treats the attacks as the work of a single perpetrator. No one has been convicted. The first victim was Muhammad Amoyuri. He was 8 years old. He was attacked and killed in the vicinity of his school, Berzelii, in a residential area of the city where children walk between home and classroom with the unself-conscious regularity of youth. The second victim was Anna-Lena Svensson. She was 56 years old. She was attacked and killed near her home in the same city, in the same brief window of evening. The distance between the locations is approximately 2 kilometers. The temporal distance is measured in minutes rather than hours. For investigators, that combination suggested not coincidence but sequence, a single actor moving through Linköping on an autumn evening with a purpose that has never been officially explained. Anna-Lena Svensson was a woman with a life that extended far beyond the headline that would eventually attach to her name. She was a wife, a mother, a member of a community. Those who knew her in the ordinary contexts of work and neighborhood have been largely absent from the public narrative, which is a common fate for adult victims in cases where the machinery of investigation focuses on the perpetrator rather than on the fullness of the lives that were ended. It is worth pausing, even briefly, to note that she was 56 years old on an ordinary October evening, that she was near her home, that the place where she should have been safe became, within moments, a crime scene that would be examined under lights and documented in a file that remains open. Muhammad Amoyuri was 8. The dignity owed to a child who dies violently is, in some ways, the hardest dignity to speak about in a narration meant for rest, because the mind resists the image even when the telling is careful. What the official record confirms is that he was young, that he was in the vicinity of his school, that his death was not an accident, and that it formed part of a sequence that terrified a city and mobilized one of the most extensive forensic investigations in Swedish criminal history. He had a family. He had a classroom. He had the ordinary expectations of a child on an autumn day. Those expectations ended on the 19th of October. The attacks were carried out with a knife. The weapon, or weapons, and the full mechanics of the assaults have been described in investigative terms rather than in the language of spectacle, and that restraint is appropriate. What matters for the record is that both victims suffered fatal stab wounds, that the scenes yielded evidence, and that the evidence included biological material from a person who has never been identified in the national DNA database in a way that led to conviction. Swedish forensic science in the early 2000s was capable of generating a partial DNA profile from material left at crime scenes. In this case, a profile was recovered and entered into the national system. It did not match any individual already recorded. This is the central forensic fact of the Linköping double murder, the piece of the perpetrator that exists in the file without a name attached to it. Investigators know something about the person who left that material. They do not know, with the certainty required for prosecution, who that person is. The investigation that followed was extensive by any measure. Linköping is not a large city, but it is not so small that every resident can be known to every other. Detectives worked through witness statements, through timeline reconstruction, through the painstaking mapping of who was where in the minutes that mattered. Leads were pursued. The case generated sustained national attention in Sweden, where the combination of a child victim and a seemingly random second killing created a climate of fear that autumn and in the winters that followed. In the 2010s, the investigation entered a phase that brought it to international attention among those who follow forensic science and cold case methodology. Swedish authorities conducted a mass DNA screening, sometimes described as a DNA dragnet, focused on men in the Linköping area whose profiles might be compared against the partial sample recovered from the crime scenes. Thousands of individuals were approached. Samples were taken. The process was voluntary in its formal structure, though the social pressure to participate in a community searching for the killer of a child was considerable. The dragnet did not produce a conviction. No match led to a named suspect who was tried and found guilty. This absence of a match is itself a significant fact. It suggests that the perpetrator was not, at the time of the screening, among those who participated, or that the partial profile was insufficient to make a definitive individual identification from the samples collected, or that the killer was not a resident of the area in the sense that the dragnet assumed. Investigators have not, in the public record, closed any of these possibilities definitively. The case remains actively investigated, which in Swedish practice means that new techniques, new tips, and new comparisons against expanding databases continue to be pursued. What the official position holds is straightforward in its outline and frustrating in its incompleteness. 2 people were murdered in Linköping on the 19th of October, 2004, within minutes and within a short distance of each other. The attacks are believed to be the work of one perpetrator. A partial DNA profile of that perpetrator exists. No one has been convicted. The investigation is ongoing. What theories exist in public discussion tend to orbit a few recurring possibilities. Some hold that the killer was a local resident who knew the area well enough to move between 2 points quickly and who either left the region before the dragnet or remained while avoiding participation. Others suggest a traveler, someone passing through Linköping on an evening that happened to align with opportunity and intent. Still others have looked for patterns, wondering whether the choice of victims carried a logic that has not yet been understood, or whether the second killing was, in some sense, opportunistic rather than planned. These are speculations. They are not findings. The official record does not endorse any of them as established fact. The school where Muhammad Amoyuri was attacked continued to exist in the landscape of the city. Children returned to its doors in subsequent autumns. Security measures were reviewed. Parents walked routes that had seemed ordinary and now carried memory. This is one of the ways a city absorbs violence without dissolving. Life continues because it must, and the continuation is not indifference but endurance. Anna-Lena Svensson's neighborhood, similarly, remained a place where people lived and slept and rose for work, carrying the knowledge that one evening had proved that proximity to home is not a guarantee. For cold case investigators, the partial DNA profile is both a promise and a waiting. DNA databases grow. International cooperation improves. A profile that matched no one in 2004 may match someone in a future year, if that person enters the system through another investigation, another arrest, another voluntary submission in another context. Cases of this kind have been solved years after the crime through exactly such indirect matches. Whether that will happen in Linköping is unknown. The official record does not predict. It continues. The autumn of 2004 in Linköping has become a fixed point in the city's memory. Residents who were present at the time remember the fear, the appeals for information, the sense that a person capable of killing twice in one evening was among them or had been among them recently. That fear has softened with time, as fear does, but the case itself has not softened into resolution. It remains hard-edged in the file: 2 deaths, 1 profile, no conviction. The timeline of the evening of the 19th of October has been reconstructed by investigators with care. The interval between the attacks was short enough to suggest urgency on the part of the perpetrator, a movement through the city that did not allow for extended planning between the 2 scenes. Whether the killer arrived in Linköping with both victims in mind, or whether the second attack was improvised after the first, is not established in the public record. Motive, in the ordinary sense of a reason that would make sense to a jury, has not been officially disclosed in a way that closes the question. Muhammad Amouri's family has lived in the years since with the particular grief of those who lose a child to violence that remains unattributed. Anna-Lena Svensson's family has carried a parallel grief, one that does not receive the same volume of public attention but is no less absolute in its personal terms. Cold cases often focus investigative language on the unknown perpetrator. The victims remain, in the official telling, two lives that ended on the same autumn evening, one just beginning and one well into its middle years, joined only by the cruelty of a stranger. Linköping University's presence in the city means that students have come and gone across the years since 2004, many of them unaware that the quiet streets they walk were once searched house by house for a killer. The city has not been defined solely by the murders, and that is appropriate. Places are larger than their worst nights. But the file remains, and the partial DNA profile waits, a fragment of identity preserved in a system designed to find matches that time has not yet provided. It is useful to distinguish what forensic science has established from what it has not. It has established that the same unknown individual appears to be linked to both scenes through biological evidence. It has not established that individual's name, residence, motive, or present whereabouts. It has established that a large-scale DNA comparison in the 2010s did not produce a prosecutable identification. It has not established that no future comparison will. The boundary between those statements is where the case lives. The victims, stated plainly once more because plainness is a form of respect, were Muhammad Amouri, 8 years old, and Anna-Lena Svensson, 56 years old. They were killed on the same evening in the same city by methods that the investigation attributes to a single attacker. Everything else that circulates in the public conversation, the identity of that attacker, the reason two such different lives were ended within minutes, the question of whether the city holds the answer in someone who has not yet been tested or has not yet been caught, belongs to the territory of the unsolved. And as the night gathers around this story, Linköping sleeps in its autumn quiet, a city that has learned to carry an open file alongside its ordinary dailiness. Streets that were walked by a killer and by two victims who did not know they shared an evening still receive footsteps. The partial DNA profile waits in a database that grows slowly, entry by entry, year by year. If a child's path home from school and a woman's path near her own door can be interrupted on the same evening by a stranger whose name the science almost knows but cannot yet speak, what does it mean to call a place safe simply because it is familiar? Karmøy is an island on the west coast of Norway, connected to the mainland by bridge and ferry, shaped by the North Sea and by the long human habit of living close to water in a landscape that is beautiful and demanding in equal measure. It is not a remote wilderness. It holds towns and schools and churches and the dense web of acquaintance that forms when a community is small enough for names to recur in conversation, for families to be linked by marriage and by proximity, and for a summer evening to feel, in the hours before darkness, like something that belongs to everyone and threatens no one. In May of 1995, that feeling was broken on Karmøy in a way that the island has not been able to leave behind. Birgitte Tengs was 13 years old. She was found dead near her home on the 19th of May, among woods in the area of Accra. She had been sexually assaulted and killed. The last confirmed sighting of her alive was on the evening of the 18th. Between that evening and the discovery of her body lay a span of hours that the investigation has never been able to fully illuminate, and within that span lies one of the most closely followed unsolved murders in modern Norwegian history. 13 is an age that carries its own particular texture of life. Old enough for independence, for walking between places without constant supervision, for the private world of friendships and routes and small freedoms that parents grant gradually. Young enough that those freedoms still rest on the assumption of safety, on the belief that a known landscape near a known home will receive a child and return her. Birgitte Tengs did not return. The woods near Accra, which may have been familiar to her as surroundings rather than as destination, became the place where her life ended and where a community's sense of its own security began a long and unfinished argument with reality. The discovery of her body initiated an investigation that moved with the urgency that any case involving a child demands. Police searched the area. Witnesses were interviewed. The family was thrust into a public grief that Norway followed with the sustained attention that small countries sometimes give to singular tragedies, where the victim is not an abstraction but a neighbor, a classmate, a face recognized from the shop or the school or the road. Appeals were made. Evidence was collected according to the forensic standards of the mid-1990s, standards that have been revisited many times since as science has advanced and as the case has been reopened. Within this landscape of grief and investigation, a suspect emerged who was also a relative. Birgitte's teenage cousin was arrested. He was, by the nature of family proximity, someone who knew her, who belonged to the same intimate social world that Karmoi's size made inevitable. The arrest was not a verdict. It was the beginning of a legal process that would, in the following year, produce one of the case's most important official facts. In 1996, the cousin was tried and acquitted. The acquittal must be stated carefully and without ambiguity, because careful language is not only a legal obligation in cases of this kind but a moral one. A court examined the evidence against the cousin and found it insufficient to support a conviction. He was not proven guilty in the eyes of the law. He was released from the charge. This does not mean that every question about the night was answered to everyone's satisfaction. It means that the state, acting through its judicial process, could not reach the threshold required to declare guilt. To treat an acquittal as proof of innocence in every sense, or as proof of guilt in defiance of the court, is to step outside the official record into the territory of private judgment, where cases like this often live for decades. The investigation did not end with the acquittal. Norwegian authorities reopened and reviewed the case multiple times in the years that followed. New forensic examinations were conducted as DNA technology improved and as material preserved from the original investigation could be revisited with methods unavailable in 1995. Cold case units and public prosecutors returned to the file with the patience and the frustration that long unsolved cases generate. No subsequent prosecution has produced a final conviction. The case, in the official sense, remains open. What this means in practical terms is that Norway has a confirmed victim, a confirmed crime, and no confirmed perpetrator in the record of convictions. The cousin who was tried and acquitted remains a figure in public discussion, because human minds seek narrative closure and because family proximity in a crime of this nature is, legitimately, a focus of investigative attention. But public discussion is not the courtroom. The courtroom spoke in 1996. The acquittal stands. Any narration of this case that does not honor that fact is not honoring the distinction between what is alleged and what is proved. Other theories have circulated over the years. Some hold that the killer was not a family member but a local stranger, someone who encountered Birgitte in the hours between her last sighting and her death, in a place or at a time that the investigation has not fully reconstructed. Others return to the question of whether forensic material that has been re-examined in later decades points in directions that the original investigation did not pursue to conviction. These theories vary in the weight of evidence their proponents claim. None of them has, as of the official record available to the public, produced a named individual convicted of killing Birgitte Tengs. The island of Karmøy continued through all of this. Seasons turned. Children grew. The case remained a presence in Norwegian media and in local memory, resurfacing when anniversaries arrived or when a new review was announced or when a fresh appeal for information was made. This persistence is not unusual for unsolved crimes involving children. What is unusual is only the length of the silence from whoever knows the full truth, the completeness of the gap between a death that was quickly discovered and a responsibility that has never been legally assigned. For Birgitte's family, the years since 1995 have been measured in the way that families measure such time. With the absence of a conviction that would finalize the public story. with the ongoing need to speak her name in contexts that remind the country that the file is still open. With the private knowledge that no public resolution can fully restore what was taken on the 19th of May. She was 13. She lived on an island where people knew one another. She walked into an evening that should have been followed by more mornings, and those mornings did not come. The forensic history of the case reflects the era of its origin and the decades of revision that followed. Evidence collected in 1995 was handled according to the protocols of its time. Later reviews applied new techniques, searching for clarity that earlier methods could not extract. Whether those reviews have yielded information useful to a future prosecution is, in large part, a matter that the investigative file holds close. The public record confirms that reviews occurred. It does not confirm a forthcoming resolution. It is worth noting the setting once more, because setting matters in how communities understand loss. Karmøy in May is not a place of perpetual darkness. The light returns. The coast is visible. The island's connection to the mainland is a matter of minutes. Birgitte's world was not isolated in the sense of a far northern settlement cut off from the world. It was a small and known world, and that smallness is part of what made the crime feel like a violation of the entire community rather than of a single household. When a child dies violently on an island of that scale, the grief does not stay indoors. The official findings, assembled across investigations and reviews, can be stated in plain terms. Birgitte Tengs was 13 years old. She was last seen alive on the evening of the 18th of May, 1995. Her body was found on the 19th of May in woods near Accra on Karmøy. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Her teenage cousin was arrested, tried in 1996, and acquitted. The case has been reopened and reviewed without a final conviction. The investigation continues. Theories remain in public circulation. The cousin, discussed in ways that the acquittal should restrain but does not always prevent in informal conversation. A local stranger unknown to the family. Forensic interpretations advanced by commentators who do not speak for the prosecution. Each theory carries its own logic. None has replaced the official status of the case as unsolved, and none has produced a conviction that would allow the legal system to close the file with the name of a perpetrator attached. The woods near Accra, where Birgitte was found, are not remote in the sense of a wilderness far from human habitation. They are the kind of marginal land that exists at the edge of settlements everywhere, close enough that a child might reach them in minutes and far enough that visibility from houses is limited. Investigators have studied the route she may have taken, the hours between her last sighting and the discovery of her body, the question of whether she entered the woods willingly or was taken there. The public record does not offer a single settled narrative of those hours. The cousin who was tried and acquitted has lived in the shadow of a case that Norwegian media has returned to repeatedly. An acquittal in a crime of this nature does not restore ordinary life in the way that acquittal in lesser matters sometimes can. The community knows the history. The name recurs. The legal system has spoken, but social memory does not always accept the finality that courts intend. This is not an argument for guilt. It is an observation about what unresolved violence does to the fabric of a small place, especially when the accused and the victim were related. Forensic reviews in later decades examined material preserved from the original scene with techniques that were not available in 1995. Norwegian prosecutors have, at various points, indicated that the case remains under active attention rather than abandoned to history. Whether those reviews have identified a viable path to a new prosecution against a different suspect, or against the same suspect on new evidence, is not fully disclosed. The official posture is continuity. The investigation continues. Birgitte's school and her classmates moved forward through the late 1990s and into a new century carrying an absence that no assembly or memorial could fully address. Teachers who had known her as a student in the ordinary way of knowing a 13-year-old faced classrooms in which one chair's emptiness was not a matter of transfer or illness but of a wound that the island had not yet learned to close. That classroom fact is not part of the forensic file. It is part of the human cost that an unsolved case continues to extract long after the immediate search has ended. Norway, as a society, has followed this case with a closeness that reflects both the age of the victim and the unsettling fact of an acquitted family member who remains, in the public imagination, near the center of the story without being, in the legal record, a convicted killer. That tension is difficult to live with. It is also the correct representation of what the law has and has not established. Uncertainty is not a failure of narration. It is the condition of the case. And as this account settles into quiet, the island of Karmøy rests in its coastal darkness, the same sea moving against the same shore it moved against on the night when a 13-year-old girl did not come home. The woods near Accra are dark now, as they were then. The file remains open. If a child can vanish into an evening on an island small enough that most paths are known, and if the law can try and acquit and still not tell the community who is responsible, what does safety mean in a place where everyone knows everyone's name? Isäjoki is a municipality in the Finnish region of South Ostrobothnia, a place of farmland and forest and small settlements where the distances between houses are measured in the quiet of country roads and the pace of life follows seasons more than headlines. In the early 1950s, Finland was rebuilding its identity in the aftermath of war, tending its rural communities with the same steady practicality that had carried it through harder years. Churches remained centers of social life. Choir practice on an October evening was not a quaint tradition but an ordinary Tuesday, a reason to walk a known route after dark in a landscape that felt, to those who lived there, like an extension of home rather than a departure from it. Kyllikki Saari was 17 years old. On the 17th of October, 1953, she attended choir practice at her local church in Isäjoki. When practice ended, she began the journey home. She was seen on that journey. Witnesses later placed her along the road between the church and the direction of her house, a young woman moving through an autumn evening in a country district where people recognized one another by silhouette and gait. She did not arrive home. The last confirmed sighting of Kyllikki Saari alive is the fixed point from which everything else in this case extends outward, into searches, into grief, into decades of investigation that have never produced a conviction. The disappearance of a 17-year-old in a rural community in 1953 did not pass unnoticed. Families raised alarm. Searches were organized. The landscape around Isäjoki was examined with the methods available at the time, methods that depended heavily on human grids walking fields and forests, on dogs, on the recollection of anyone who might have seen a bicycle, a figure, a detail that seemed insignificant until it was sought. Kyllikki's bicycle was found. It was left at a place called Lotukka, and its discovery narrowed the geography of the search while deepening the fear that something had intervened between the girl and her home. Autumn in South Ostrobothnia darkens early. The roads are not lit as modern roads are lit. A young woman walking or cycling between church and home was moving through a familiar darkness that became, in the hours after she failed to arrive, a darkness of a different kind. The community held its breath in the way rural communities do, with phones that were not yet universal and with communication that moved by word and by effort, neighbor to neighbor, farm to farm, until the absence was certain and the search became formal. Months passed without resolution. Winter came to Isäjoki. The search continued in forms appropriate to snow and frozen ground. Spring followed. And in May of 1954, more than 6 months after Kyllikki Saari vanished, her remains were discovered in Vainiolabog, in a part of the landscape that holds water and peat and the slow preservation of secrets. She had been murdered. The discovery confirmed what her family and her community had feared through the long months of not knowing, and it opened an investigation into a killing that would become one of Finland's most enduring cold cases. The condition of the remains and the time that had passed between disappearance and discovery limited what the pathologists of the era could say with precision. This is a recurring feature of historical cases. Science answers questions only with the material it receives, and material that has spent months in a bog does not yield the same clarity that a fresh scene might offer to a modern forensic team. Investigators worked with what they had. Suspects were considered. Leads were pursued through a countryside where many men knew many paths and where the social world of a 17-year-old girl, however quiet, was not entirely invisible. Among the persons of interest who would surface in the investigation and in later public discussion was Hans Assmann, a German-born man who had come to live in Finland and whose name would, in subsequent decades, be linked speculatively to other unsolved crimes, including the Lake Bodom murders of 1960. Assmann was investigated in connection with Kyllikki Saari's death. He was not convicted. The official record does not support a settled conclusion naming him as the killer. His presence in the case is part of the theory landscape rather than the conviction landscape, a name that recurs because unsolved cases create patterns of association that investigators and the public examine in search of coherence. Other suspects and other theories have been proposed across the 70 years and more that have followed the discovery in Vainiola bog. Some suggest a local man acting with opportunity and concealment, someone who knew the roads and the bogs and the habits of a community small enough that a choir evening was a known event. Others propose jealousy or personal conflict within the orbit of Kyllikki's life, the kind of motive that rural investigations have historically pursued when stranger crime seems less probable than acquaintance crime. Still others return to Assmann, to the idea of an outsider whose movements through Finland in the post-war years intersected with multiple unsolved deaths. None of these theories has produced a conviction. That absence is the case's defining official fact. The public memorialization of Kyllikki Saari has been considerable. She has not been forgotten in the manner of victims whose names survive only in archived newspaper pages. Her case has been revisited when anniversaries arrive, when new investigators review old files, when Finland's appetite for resolution in its famous cold cases turns, as it periodically does, toward the oldest wounds. The bog where she was found has become part of the geography of memory, a place that local people know as more than wetland, as a coordinate in a story that did not end with the discovery of remains. For cold case work, the Saari file illustrates both the limits and the persistence of historical investigation. Evidence that might have been collected differently in another era was collected as well as 1953 allowed. Witnesses who were alive then are, for the most part, not alive now. Statements that were recorded have been reread. Physical material has been re-examined when preservation allowed. Statutes of limitation and procedural rules have shifted across the decades, altering what prosecution could attempt even if a suspect were named tomorrow. The case is open in a cultural sense and constrained in the legal sense, a combination that defines many mid-century murders in the Nordic countries. Kyllikki herself remains, in the record, 17 years old. She sang in a church choir. She walked a road she knew on an October evening. She had a family that waited through a winter for news that came in the form of confirmation of their worst fear. The 6 months between disappearance and discovery were 6 months of suspended grief, of searches that covered familiar ground and returned without her, of a community that held a space open for her return until the bog made that space permanent. It is important to distinguish what the investigation has established from what it has not. It has established that she was murdered. It has established the location where her remains were found. It has established a last sighting on the road home from choir practice. It has not established, in the form of a conviction that has survived the legal process, who killed her. Theories fill that gap in public conversation. The official record does not. The rural Finland of 1953 is not the rural Finland of the present. Roads have been improved. Communications have transformed. Forensic science has become something the investigators of that year could scarcely have imagined. Yet the case remains, carried forward by the same fundamental insufficiency that has carried it since May of 1954. Someone knows, or knew, what happened between the last sighting on the road and the resting place in Vainiola Bog. That knowledge has not entered the courtroom in a form that produced a verdict. Hans Assmann died without being convicted in this case or in any of the other cases to which his name has been attached in theory and in investigative attention. Carl Gyllström, who would later be discussed in connection with Lake Bodom, belongs to a later crime. The Saari case stands on its own in the official file, earlier and unresolved, a predecessor in the long Finnish catalogue of famous unsolved deaths. The temptation to link them is understandable. It is also, without conviction-grade evidence, only a temptation. The 6 months between Kyllikki's disappearance and the discovery of her body were, for her family, a period measured in daily hope against accumulating dread. Rural searches in the 1950s depended on volunteers who knew the land, who could walk a line across a field or stand in a chain across a heath and call a name that did not answer. The bicycle at Lutukka told investigators something about where her journey had been interrupted, but it did not tell them by whom or under what circumstances. That gap between object and explanation has never been closed. Choir practice at the church was an ordinary Tuesday anchor in her week. The other members of the choir would have expected to see her again at the next practice, at the next service, in the ordinary recurrence of community worship. Her absence from those recurrences became, over time, a permanent one, and the church that had been a place of music became also a place of memory. Large public memorials in later decades have kept her name present in Finnish culture in a way that many victims of unsolved crimes are not. That memorialization is a form of dignity. It is not a substitute for conviction. Hans Assmann's connection to the case remains, in the official record, a matter of investigation rather than of proven fact. He was questioned. He was not convicted. When his name later appeared in discussions of Lake Bodom, some observers saw a pattern. Investigators and courts, working with the evidence available in each case separately, did not convert that pattern into verdicts. The temptation to see one hand behind multiple famous unsolved deaths is a human temptation. It does not, without proof, become history. The statute of limitations for murder in Finland has changed across the decades since 1953. Modern law does not time-bar the prosecution of homicide in the way that earlier frameworks sometimes did. Whether that change offers any practical hope for the Saari case depends on evidence that can still be tested, witnesses who can still speak, and a suspect who can still be brought before a court. Much of what was knowable in the months after May 1954 is no longer knowable in the same way. For listeners resting in the quiet of a late hour, the case may settle as a study in rural time. Not the compressed time of a city crime witnessed by dozens, but the extended time of a countryside where a girl can be last seen on a road and not found for months, where a bog can hold what a winter of searching could not locate, where 70 years can pass and still leave a choir practice on an October evening feeling immediate to anyone who has ever walked home alone after dark. The official findings, stated plainly, are these. Kyllikki Saari, 17 years old, disappeared on the 17th of October, 1953, after attending choir practice in Isäjoki, Finland. Her bicycle was found at Lutukka. Her remains were discovered in May of 1954 in Vainiola Bog. She had been murdered. Multiple suspects have been considered over the decades, including Hans Assmann. No one has been convicted. The case remains one of Finland's most discussed unresolved homicides. Theories continue. Local acquaintance crime. Outsider crime. Named individuals investigated but not convicted. Patterns sought between this case and later cases that share only the quality of being unsolved. Each theory offers a shape to the silence. None has closed the file. Isäjoki tonight is as it was in ways that matter. Dark fields. Church towers against low horizons. Roads that run between places where people know one another. The bog at Vainiola holds its stillness. The file holds its questions. If a girl can walk a road she has walked 100 times and not reach home, and if 70 years of looking can still not name the person who chose that road as the beginning of an ending, what does it mean to trust the paths we know simply because we have always known them?